Boy discovers father's secret in the room and understands why he cried every night after the maid slept. In a quiet suburban home, 11-year-old Tommy Thompson's world is about to be turned upside down. As night falls and the house grows still, a muffled sound catches his attention, the unmistakable sobs of his father, the town's most respected pediatrician. What dark secret could reduce this pillar of the community to tears? As Tommy begins to unravel the mystery, he'll discover that sometimes the line between right and wrong isn't as clear as we'd like to believe, and that even those we trust most can hide earth-shattering secrets. Get ready for a story that will challenge your perceptions, tug at your heartstrings, and leave you questioning the true nature of morality in the face of desperate hope. In the quiet suburbs of Millbrook, Connecticut, where manicured lawns stretched like green carpets and white picket fences stood as silent sentinels, the Thompson family's colonial-style house looked just like any other. But behind its powder blue shutters and neatly trimmed hedges, a secret lurked, waiting to unravel the very fabric of their seemingly perfect lives. 11-year-old Tommy Thompson lay in his bed, his Spider-Man comforter pulled up to his chin, eyes wide open in the darkness. The digital clock on his nightstand blinked 11:42 p.m., its red glow casting eerie shadows on the wall. He should have been asleep hours ago, but something kept him awake, a sound that had become all too familiar over the past few months. Muffled sobs echoed through the house, barely audible but unmistakable to Tommy's young ears. It was his father, Dr. James Thompson, the town's most respected pediatrician. Every night, like clockwork, after their housekeeper, Mrs. Gonzalez, retired to her room in the basement, the crying would begin. Tommy's small fingers clutched the edge of his comforter, his heart heavy with a mix of confusion and concern. Why would his dad, a man who always wore a smile and had a joke ready for his patients, break down every night? It didn't make sense. As he lay there, his mind drifted to earlier that day. He had overheard a hushed conversation between his parents in the kitchen. His mother, Sarah, a high-powered attorney, had been speaking in that clipped tone she used when she was upset. "James, we need to talk about this," she had whispered urgently. "It can't go on like this. Think about Tommy." His father's response had been too low to hear, but Tommy had caught a glimpse of his face, pale, drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that no amount of coffee seemed to erase these days. A sudden creak in the hallway snapped Tommy back to the present. He held his breath, listening intently. Footsteps, slow and heavy, passed by his door. They paused for a moment, and Tommy's heart raced. Would his father come in? But then they continued, heading towards the master bedroom at the end of the hall. Tommy waited until he heard the soft click of a door closing before he dared to move. Slowly, carefully, he slipped out of bed, his bare feet silent on the plush carpet. He tiptoed to his bedroom door and opened it just a crack, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. The house was still, save for the distant hum of the air conditioning and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. Tommy's eyes were drawn to a sliver of light spilling from beneath his parents' bedroom door. The muffled sobs had ceased, replaced by what sounded like rustling paper. Curiosity overwhelmed caution. Tommy crept down the hallway, his back pressed against the wall, moving with the stealth of a cat. As he neared his parents' room, he could make out his father's voice, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," James Thompson was saying, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." Tommy froze, his hand inches from the doorknob. Who was his father talking to? His mother was away on a business trip, and Mrs. Gonzalez was surely asleep by now. Just then, a floorboard creaked beneath Tommy's foot. The rustling inside the room stopped abruptly. "Hello?" his father called out, a note of panic in his voice. "Is someone there?" Tommy's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he should run back to his room, pretend he'd never left his bed. But something kept him rooted to the spot, his hand hovering over the doorknob. In that moment, as the silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap, Tommy made a decision that would change everything. He took a deep breath, steeled his nerves, and slowly turned the doorknob. The door swung open, revealing a scene that would be forever etched in Tommy's memory. His father sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by a sea of papers, photos, and what looked like medical charts. In his hands, he clutched a worn, leather-bound journal. Dr. James Thompson looked up, his face a mask of shock and fear as he locked eyes with his son. "Tommy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" But Tommy couldn't answer. His eyes were fixed on a photo that had fallen to the floor, a picture of a little girl he had never seen before, smiling brightly despite the hospital gown she wore. As father and son stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken words and hidden truths, one thing became crystal clear to young Tommy Thompson. Nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The tension in the room was palpable as Dr. James Thompson slowly set down the leather-bound journal, his hands trembling. Tommy stood frozen in the doorway, his young mind struggling to process the scene before him. "Son," James began, his voice barely above a whisper, "you shouldn't be up this late." But Tommy's eyes were fixed on the scattered papers and photos. "Dad," he said, his voice small but steady, "who's that girl in the picture?" James flinched as if he'd been struck. He glanced down at the photo on the floor, then back at his son. For a moment, it seemed he might try to deflect, to send Tommy back to bed with a pat on the head and a reassuring lie. But something in the boy's determined gaze made him reconsider. "Close the door, Tommy," he said with a resigned sigh. "There's something I need to tell you." As Tommy stepped into the room and shut the door behind him, Mrs. Gonzalez stirred in her basement bedroom. The muffled voices from upstairs had roused her from a fitful sleep. She lay still, straining to hear, a knot of worry forming in her stomach. In the months she'd worked for the Thompsons, she'd grown fond of the family, especially young Tommy. But lately, she'd sensed a growing tension, particularly in Dr. Thompson. Upstairs, Tommy perched on the edge of the bed beside his father, careful not to disturb the papers surrounding them. James picked up the photo of the smiling girl in the hospital gown. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is Lily. She was my patient about 5 years ago, before you were old enough to remember." Tommy studied the photo. The girl looked to be about his age, with bright blue eyes and a gap-toothed grin. Despite the hospital setting, she radiated joy. "She had a rare form of leukemia," James continued. "I treated her for almost 2 years. She was the bravest little girl I've ever known." A tear slid down James's cheek, and he quickly wiped it away. Tommy felt a lump forming in his throat. "What happened to her, Dad?" James closed his eyes, pain etched across his features. She didn't make it, son. I tried everything, every treatment, every experimental drug. But in the end, it wasn't enough." Tommy's mind reeled. He'd always known his father's job was to help sick kids, but he'd never really thought about what happened when he couldn't save them. "Is that why you cry at night, Dad? Because of Lily?" James looked at his son, surprise and shame mingling in his expression. "You've heard me? Oh, Tommy, I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to." He trailed off, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It's not just about Lily, son. It's complicated." Tommy's gaze fell on the leather journal. "Is that why you write in that book every night?" James picked up the journal, running his fingers over its worn cover. "This journal, it's where I keep track of all my patients, the ones I've saved, and the ones I couldn't." He flipped through the pages, revealing neat columns of names, dates, and notations. "I started keeping it after Lily died. I thought if I could learn from each case, maybe I could save the next child. Maybe I could make sure no other family had to go through what Lily's did." Tommy felt a swell of pride for his father, mixed with a deep sadness. "But Dad, you help so many kids. You can't save everyone, right?" James gave a bitter laugh. "That's what your mother says. But Tommy, you don't understand. There's more to this than just Lily. There's something I've done, something I can't take back." He turned to a page near the back of the journal, where the neat columns gave way to frantic scribbles. "After Lily died, I became obsessed with finding a cure. I started experimenting, trying treatments that weren't approved, bending rules that shouldn't be bent. Tommy's eyes widened. Is that bad? James nodded slowly. It is when you go too far, and I'm afraid I have, son. I've crossed a line, and now I don't know how to make it right. Just then, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Both James and Tommy turned towards the door, hearts pounding. "James?" came a soft voice. "Is everything all right?" It was Mrs. Gonzalez, standing in the doorway in her robe, concern etched on her face. As she took in the scene, the scattered papers, the tearful father and son, her expression changed from worry to something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "Oh, Dr. Thompson," she said softly. "It's time, isn't it? Time to tell the truth." James and Tommy exchanged confused glances. What did Mrs. Gonzalez know? And how was she connected to the secrets that threatened to tear their family apart? As the clock on the nightstand ticked past midnight, the Thompson house held its breath, poised on the brink of revelations that would change everything. Mrs. Gonzalez stepped into the room, her weathered hands clasped tightly in front of her. The air grew thick with tension as she looked from James to Tommy, then back again. "I never thought this day would come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But perhaps it's for the best. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply we try to bury it." James stood up abruptly, his face a mix of confusion and alarm. "Maria, what are you talking about? How could you possibly know about?" She held up a hand, silencing him. "Dr. Thompson, I've worked for your family for 3 years now. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the late-night crying, the secret phone calls, the mysterious packages that arrived when Mrs. Thompson was away?" Tommy's head was spinning. He looked at Mrs. Gonzalez, this woman he'd known his whole life, and suddenly felt like he was seeing a stranger. "Mrs. Gonzalez, what's going on? Do you know about Dad's secret?" The housekeeper's eyes softened as she gazed at the young boy. "Oh, Tommy," she sighed, "I know more than you can imagine. You see, before I came to work for your family, I worked at St. Mary's Children's Hospital." James inhaled sharply. "That's where Lily was treated," Mrs. Gonzalez finished for him. "Yes, Dr. Thompson. I was there. I saw everything." She moved further into the room, perching on the edge of an armchair. "I was a janitor at the hospital back then. I cleaned the oncology ward where you worked, Dr. Thompson. I saw you with Lily, saw how hard you fought for her. And I saw what happened after she died." James sank back onto the bed, his face ashen. "You knew? All this time?" Mrs. Gonzalez nodded solemnly. "I saw you in the lab late at night, mixing chemicals that weren't on any approved list. I heard you arguing with the hospital board about experimental treatments. And I was there the night of the fire." Tommy's eyes widened. "Fire? What fire?" James buried his face in his hands. "Oh God," he moaned. "Maria, please." But Mrs. Gonzalez continued, her voice steady. "It was about a month after Lily passed. Dr. Thompson had been working nonstop on some new treatment. I was cleaning near the lab when I heard the explosion. By the time the fire department arrived, half the research wing was gone." Tommy turned to his father, shock written across his young face. "Dad, is this true? Did you cause a fire at the hospital?" James looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "It was an accident, Tommy. I was trying to synthesize a new compound, something that could have saved Lily if I'd only figured it out sooner. But the chemicals were unstable and I miscalculated." Mrs. Gonzalez leaned forward, her voice softening. "No one was hurt in the fire, Tommy, but a lot of important research was lost. And your father, well, he left the hospital soon after. They forced me out," James said bitterly. "Said I was a liability. That's when we moved here, started over. I thought I could leave it all behind." Tommy's mind was reeling. The perfect image he had of his father, the hero who saved sick children, was crumbling before his eyes. But as he looked at his dad, He saw not a fallen hero, but a broken man consumed by guilt and regret. But you didn't leave it behind, did you, Dr. Thompson? Mrs. Gonzalez said gently. You've been continuing your research here, haven't you? Those packages, the late-night phone calls. James nodded slowly. Couldn't stop Maria. Not when there are still children out there dying from diseases we should be able to cure. I had to keep trying. Tommy found his voice again. Is that why Mom's been so angry lately? Does she know? James shook his head. No, your mother doesn't know the full extent of it. She knows I've been struggling since Lily's death, but she doesn't know about the fire or about my current research. I've been keeping it from her, trying to protect her. Mrs. Gonzalez stood up, her expression grave. Dr. Thompson, I've kept your secret all these years because I believed in what you were trying to do, but this can't go on. The guilt is eating you alive, and now it's affecting your family. It's time to come clean. James looked at her, then at Tommy, his expression a mix of fear and resolve. You're right, Maria. It's time. But there's more to this story, more that even you don't know. And once I tell you, there's no going back. As the three of them sat in the dimly lit bedroom, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air, none of them noticed the blinking light on James's cell phone. A new message had arrived, its contents about to add yet another layer to the complex web of secrets surrounding the Thompson family. In the stillness of the night, as crickets chirped outside and the old house creaked and settled, Dr. James Thompson prepared to reveal the full extent of his actions, a revelation that would forever change the lives of everyone in that room and beyond. As James opened his mouth to continue his confession, a sharp buzz cut through the tense silence. All eyes darted to his cell phone on the nightstand, its screen illuminating with an incoming call. James froze, his face draining of color as he stared at the device. It's him, he whispered, his voice trembling. Tommy leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the caller ID, but his father snatched the phone up before he could see it. I have to take this, James said, his tone urgent. Please, give me a moment. He stood and walked to the far corner of the room, his back to Tommy and Mrs. Gonzalez as he answered the call in a hushed voice. Dr. Reeves? Yes, I'm alone. What's happened? Tommy and Mrs. Gonzalez exchanged worried glances. The housekeeper placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder, but her own expression was taut with concern. As James continued his whispered conversation, Tommy strained to hear, catching only fragments. Unstable, need more time, can't rush this. Ethical concerns, board won't approve. Meet tomorrow, usual place. After what seemed like an eternity, James ended the call and turned back to face them. His expression was a mix of excitement and fear, his eyes wild with a fervor Tommy had never seen before. Dad, Tommy ventured hesitantly. Who was that? What's going on? James ran a hand through his hair, his mind clearly racing. That was a colleague, Dr. Reeves. He's been helping me with my research. Mrs. Gonzalez's eyes narrowed. Research? Dr. Thompson, please tell me you haven't been. I had to Maria. James cut her off, his voice rising with emotion. You don't understand. What we're working on, it could change everything, save countless lives. He began pacing the room, his words tumbling out in a rush. After the fire at St. Mary's, I couldn't just give up. I knew I was close to a breakthrough. Dr. Reeves felt the same way. He helped me set up a lab off the books. We've been working in secret, testing new compounds, pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Tommy's head was spinning. But Dad, isn't that illegal? James stopped pacing, kneeling down in front of his son. Sometimes, Tommy, to do what's right, we have to work outside the system. The treatments we're developing, they're too experimental, too risky for the medical board to approve. But they're working. We're seeing results that no one thought possible. Mrs. Gonzalez stepped forward, her voice stern. Dr. Thompson, you're talking about human trials, aren't you? Unauthorized experiments on sick children. Do you realize the danger you're putting them in? The legal consequences if you're caught. James stood up, facing the housekeeper. Of course I understand the risks, Maria, but you've seen what conventional treatments do. The suffering, the pain, often with no guarantee of success. What we're doing, it's giving hope to families who have none left. He turned back to Tommy, his eyes pleading. Son, you have to understand. After Lily, I couldn't bear to see another child suffer like that. Not when I knew there might be a way to save them. Tommy felt torn. Part of him was in awe of his father's dedication, his willingness to risk everything to save lives. But another part was terrified of the consequences, of the moral line his father seemed to have crossed. What about Mom? Tommy asked quietly. Does she know any of this? James's face fell. No, she doesn't. I've been keeping it from her to protect her. If this gets out, if we're discovered, your mother's career could be ruined just by association. Mrs. Gonzalez shook her head, her expression a mix of disappointment and concern. Dr. Thompson, this can't continue. You're not just risking your own future, but your family's as well. And those children. Their families deserve to know the truth about the treatments they're receiving. James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another buzz from his phone interrupted. This time it was a text message. As he read it, the color drained from his face. Oh no, he whispered, his voice barely audible. No, no, no. Dad, Tommy said, fear creeping into his voice. What is it? James looked up, his eyes wide with panic. It's one of our patients, Emily. She's having a severe reaction to the treatment. We need to go to the lab now. He grabbed his coat, moving towards the door with frantic energy. I have to go. Maria, please, watch Tommy. Don't tell Sarah anything. I'll explain everything when I get back. As James rushed out of the room, Tommy called after him. Dad, wait. Let me come with you. But Mrs. Gonzalez held him back, her grip firm but gentle. No, Tommy. It's too dangerous. Your father needs to handle this on his own. As the sound of James's car starting up and speeding away filled the night air, Tommy and Mrs. Gonzalez were left standing in the bedroom, surrounded by scattered papers and unanswered questions. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed 2 a.m., its sonorous tones echoing through the now silent house. Tommy looked up at Mrs. Gonzalez, his young face etched with worry and determination. We can't just sit here, he said. We have to do something. We have to help Dad. Mrs. Gonzalez nodded slowly, a plan already forming in her mind. You're right, Tommy. But first, there's something I need to show you. Something I've been keeping secret for a very long time. As she led Tommy out of the bedroom and towards the basement, neither of them noticed the car that had just pulled up across the street, its headlights switching off as a figure sat watching the Thompson house, waiting. The night was far from over, and the revelations were only beginning. The wooden stairs creaked under their feet as Tommy and Mrs. Gonzalez descended into the basement. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of laundry detergent and old books. Tommy had rarely ventured down here. It had always been Mrs. Gonzalez's domain, off-limits to the curious 11-year-old. Mrs. Gonzalez, Tommy whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. What are we doing down here? The housekeeper didn't respond immediately. Instead, she led him past the washer and dryer, past shelves stacked with canned goods and old holiday decorations, to a corner of the basement Tommy had never paid much attention to before. There, partially hidden behind a stack of cardboard boxes, was an old filing cabinet. Mrs. Gonzalez pulled a key from her pocket and unlocked the bottom drawer. Your father isn't the only one with secrets, Tommy, she said softly, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. I've been keeping things from him too. Things I thought I'd never have to reveal. She pulled out a thick manila envelope, its edges worn and yellowed with age. Before I worked at St. Mary's, before I became a housekeeper, I was someone else entirely. Tommy watched, wide-eyed, as Mrs. Gonzalez emptied the contents of the envelope onto a nearby folding table. Photographs spilled out, along with official-looking documents and what appeared to be newspaper clippings. My real name is Dr. Maria Gonzalez, she said. her voice barely above a whisper. 20 years ago, I was a research scientist working on cutting-edge gene therapy treatments for childhood cancers. Tommy's jaw dropped. You're a doctor? But why are you working as our housekeeper? Maria's eyes misted over as she picked up one of the photographs. It showed a younger version of herself in a lab coat, smiling proudly next to a group of other scientists. I made a mistake, Tommy. A terrible mistake that cost lives. Her voice trembled as she continued. We thought we had developed a breakthrough treatment. The early trials were promising, but we rushed it, pushed too hard too fast. And children died. Tommy felt a chill run down his spine. The parallels to his father's story were uncanny. What happened then? Maria's shoulders sagged. There was an investigation. My medical license was revoked. I was disgraced, my career in ruins. I couldn't bear to stay in the medical field after that, even in a lower position. So I reinvented myself, became Maria the housekeeper. I thought I could leave it all behind. She looked at Tommy, her eyes suddenly fierce. But I never stopped learning, never stopped researching. I've been following your father's work from the shadows, recognizing the same dangerous path I once walked. Tommy's mind was reeling. So all this time you've been watching, Maria finished for him. Guiding where I could, trying to prevent your father from making the same mistakes I did. But I'm afraid he's gone too far now, just as I did all those years ago. She began gathering up the documents, her movements urgent. Tommy, we need to stop your father before history repeats itself. Dr. Reeves, I recognize that name. He was involved in my research too, always pushing for faster results, no matter the cost. Just then, they heard a noise from upstairs, the sound of the front door opening. Tommy's heart leapt. Dad? Is that you? But Maria's face had gone pale. She quickly shoved the documents back into the envelope. It's too early for your father to be back, she whispered. Tommy, stay here. Don't make a sound. She crept up the basement stairs, Tommy close behind despite her warning. As they reached the top, they could hear footsteps moving through the house, too light to be Dr. Thompson's. Maria turned to Tommy, her finger to her lips. Slowly, she eased open the basement door. The sight that greeted them made Tommy's blood run cold. A figure dressed in black was rifling through his father's desk in the study, clearly searching for something. Maria pulled Tommy back, closing the door silently. We need to call the police, she whispered. But as she reached for her phone, another sound made them both freeze. A car pulling into the driveway. Through the small basement window, they could see headlights. Dr. Thompson was home. Tommy looked at Maria, panic rising in his chest. His father was about to walk into a house with an intruder, unaware of the danger that awaited him. And somewhere across town, a girl named Emily was fighting for her life, the victim of an experimental treatment gone wrong. In that moment, Tommy realized that the world of adults was far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. And somehow, he found himself at the center of it all, holding pieces of a puzzle he didn't fully understand. As the sound of a key turning in the front door lock echoed through the house, Tommy knew that the next few minutes would change everything. The truth was about to come out, one way or another, and nothing would ever be the same again. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he heard his father's footsteps in the entryway. The intruder upstairs had gone silent, likely alerted by the sound of Dr. Thompson's return. Maria gripped Tommy's shoulder, her face etched with worry and indecision. We have to warn Dad, Tommy whispered urgently. Maria nodded, her expression resolute. Stay here, she mouthed, before quietly opening the basement door and slipping out. But Tommy couldn't just wait. He crept up the stairs, positioning himself to peek through the crack in the door. What he saw made his blood run cold. His father had just entered the living room, looking haggard and distressed. Before James could react, the intruder emerged from the study, a gun glinting in their hand. Don't move, Dr. Thompson, a familiar voice commanded. Tommy's eyes widened in shock as he recognized Dr. Reeves, his father's research partner. James raised his hands slowly. Nathan, what are you doing? What's going on? Dr. Reeves's face was a mask of anger and desperation. It's over, James. Emily's parents are threatening to go to the authorities. We need to destroy all the evidence now. Nathan, please, James pleaded. Emily's condition has stabilized. We can fix this, explain. Explain. Dr. Reeves laughed bitterly. Explain how we've been experimenting on children without approval? How we've violated every ethical guideline in the book. No, James. It ends tonight. Tommy watched in horror as Dr. Reeves gestured with the gun towards his father's study. Get in there and start shredding everything. Every file, every record. We're wiping the slate clean. Just then, Maria stepped into view, her hands raised placatingly. Dr. Reeves, she said calmly. You don't want to do this. Both men turned in surprise. Maria, James gasped. What are you? Step back. Both of you. Dr. Reeves shouted, his gun hand shaking. This doesn't concern you, housekeeper. Maria took a step forward, her voice steady. It concerns me more than you know, Nathan. Or should I say, Dr. Nathan Reeves, former research associate at Genentech. Dr. Reeves's eyes widened in recognition. You're Dr. Maria Gonzalez. But how? I've been watching you both, Maria explained, her eyes never leaving the gun. I recognized the path you were on because I walked it myself years ago. The desperation to save lives, the willingness to cross ethical lines. I've been there. James looked between Maria and Dr. Reeves. Confusion etched on his face. What's going on? Maria, you're a doctor. I was, Maria replied softly, until my own experimental treatments went wrong. Just like yours are now, James. Dr. Reeves's hand tightened on the gun. It doesn't matter who you are. You can't stop this. We have to protect ourselves, our work. Your work? A new voice cut in. Everyone turned to see Tommy standing in the doorway of the basement, his young face set with determination. What about Emily? What about all the other kids you're supposed to be helping? Tommy, James cried out. Son, please go back downstairs. It's not safe. But Tommy stood his ground. No, Dad. I heard everything. You and Dr. Reeves have been hurting people trying to help them. But Mrs. Gonzalez, Dr. Gonzalez, she knows what happens when you go too far. You have to stop this, Dad. You have to make it right. The room fell silent, the weight of Tommy's words hanging in the air. Dr. Reeves's gun hand wavered, uncertainty creeping into his expression. James looked at his son, then at Maria, his face a mask of shame and realization. You're right, Tommy, he said softly. We've lost our way. This has to end. He turned to Dr. Reeves. Nathan, put the gun down. We'll turn ourselves in, explain everything. It's the only way to truly help our patients now. Dr. Reeves shook his head, desperation in his eyes. No, I can't. My career, my life, it's all over if we do that. It's over anyway, Maria said gently. But you have a choice now. Face the consequences with dignity or make things worse. Think of the example you want to set for the children you've been trying to save. For a moment, it seemed like Dr. Reeves might refuse. But then, slowly, he lowered the gun. As if on cue, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. Someone had called the police. Perhaps a neighbor who had seen the strange car or heard the commotion. James moved to his son, enveloping him in a tight hug. I'm so sorry, Tommy, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I never meant for any of this to happen. Tommy hugged his father back, feeling the man's body shake with silent sobs. I know, Dad. I know you were trying to help. But sometimes doing the right thing is harder than we think. As red and blue lights began to flash through the windows, Maria placed a hand on James's shoulder. It's time to face the music, Dr. Thompson. But you won't face it alone. I'll be right there with you, telling my story too. Maybe together we can prevent others from making the same mistakes we did. The front door burst open as police officers flooded in, shouting commands. In the chaos that followed the reading of rights, the handcuffing, the questions, Tommy stood watching, his young mind grappling with the complexities of adult decisions and their consequences. As his father was led away, James looked back at his son one last time. In that moment, despite everything, Tommy saw not a criminal, but a man who had lost his way trying to do good. And he knew, with a certainty beyond his years, that this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new, more honest chapter. The night that had begun with a whisper of secrets had ended in a thunderclap of truth. And as the first light of dawn began to break over Millbrook, Connecticut, Tommy Thompson knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days following that fateful night unfolded like a surreal dream for Tommy Thompson. His once quiet suburban life had been turned upside down, thrust into a whirlwind of police interviews, news reporters camped outside their house, and hushed conversations between his mother and a parade of stern-faced lawyers. Sarah Thompson had returned from her business trip to find her world shattered. Tommy watched as his mother cycled through shock, anger, and grief, struggling to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the desperate researcher who had crossed ethical lines. 1 week after the arrest, Tommy sat in the living room, absently flipping through channels on the TV. Every news station seemed to be talking about his father and Dr. Reeves. Words like unauthorized human trials, medical malpractice, and criminal negligence flashed across the screen, each one feeling like a punch to Tommy's gut. In a shocking turn of events, Dr. James Thompson and Dr. Nathan Reeves, once respected pediatricians, now face multiple charges related to illegal medical experimentation on minors. Sources close to the investigation reveal that the doctors had been conducting unauthorized trials of an experimental cancer treatment. Tommy quickly changed the channel, unable to bear hearing more. He looked up to see his mother standing in the doorway, her face drawn and tired. "Tommy," Sarah said softly, "we need to talk." She sat down next to him on the couch, taking his hand in hers. "I know this has been incredibly hard for you. I want you to know that no matter what happens, I love you, and your father loves you too." Tommy nodded, fighting back tears. "Is Dad going to go to jail?" Sarah sighed heavily. "I don't know, honey. The lawyers are doing everything they can. But what your father did was very serious. He broke a lot of laws, even if he thought he was helping people. But he was trying to save kids, Mom," Tommy protested. "Doesn't that count for anything?" Sarah pulled him into a hug. "It does, sweetheart, and that's what makes this situation so complicated. Sometimes good intentions can lead us down the wrong path if we're not careful." Just then, there was a knock at the door. Sarah tensed, likely expecting another reporter or curious neighbor. But when she opened it, Maria Gonzalez stood there, looking somewhat out of place in a smart business suit instead of her usual housekeeping attire. "Mrs. Thompson," Maria said, her voice hesitant. "I know this might not be the best time, but I was hoping we could talk. There's more to this story that you need to know." Sarah's eyes narrowed, but after a moment's hesitation, she stepped aside to let Maria in. As the two women sat down, Tommy couldn't help but notice how different Maria looked, more confident, more authoritative. This was Dr. Maria Gonzalez, not just their housekeeper. Over the next hour, Maria laid out her own history, her past as a researcher, the tragic results of her own experimental treatments, and how she had been watching over James, trying to guide him away from making the same mistakes she had. Sarah listened in stunned silence, occasionally glancing at Tommy as if seeing him in a new light. When Maria finished, Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell us sooner? Why keep up this charade?" Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I was a coward, Mrs. Thompson. I thought I could protect your family by watching from the shadows, but I was wrong. If I had been honest from the beginning, maybe I could have prevented all of this." Tommy, who had been quiet throughout Maria's explanation, suddenly spoke up. "But you can help now, right? You can tell the judge that Dad was just trying to help like you were. Maybe they'll go easier on him." Maria nodded slowly. "I've already spoken to the authorities, Tommy. I've offered to testify about my own experiences and how they relate to your father's actions. It might not change the outcome entirely, but it could help the court understand the complexity of the situation. Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "This is all so much to take in. James, the experiments. How am I supposed to explain all of this to Tommy? To our friends and family?" Maria stood as well, her voice gentle but firm. "With honesty, Mrs. Thompson, it's the only way forward now. The truth may be painful, but it's also the path to healing for your family and for all those affected by what James and Nathan did." As the adults continued to talk, Tommy slipped out of the room and up to his father's study. He hadn't been in here since that night, and it felt strange, almost sacred to enter now. The room was mostly bare, many of its contents seized by the police as evidence. But on the desk, one framed photo remained, a picture of Lily, the little girl whose death had set this whole tragedy in motion. Tommy picked up the frame, studying Lily's smiling face. He thought about Emily, the girl who had nearly died from his father's treatment, and all the other children who had been part of the unauthorized trials. He thought about his father, brilliant and flawed, sitting in a jail cell. He thought about Maria, carrying the weight of her own past mistakes for all these years. And in that moment, Tommy Thompson made a decision. He may have been just 11 years old, but he knew with absolute certainty what he wanted to do with his life. He would become a doctor, not to experiment or push boundaries, but to heal, to comfort, and to always put the patients first. As he set the photo back on the desk, Tommy felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it. After all, he had learned the hardest lesson of all at a very young age, that the line between right and wrong was often blurry, but it was a line that must be walked with great care and even greater compassion. Downstairs, he could hear his mother and Maria still talking, their voices a low murmur of shared grief and tentative plans for the future. Tommy took one last look around the study before closing the door behind him. It was time to join them, to be part of shaping whatever came next for the Thompson family. As he descended the stairs, Tommy felt older, wiser, and more determined than ever before. The night that had started with a whisper in the dark had ended with a harsh light of truth. But from that truth, a new path was emerging, one that Tommy was ready to walk, no matter where it might lead. 3 months had passed since that fateful night, and the day of Dr. James Thompson's preliminary hearing had finally arrived. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and curious onlookers as Tommy, Sarah, and Maria made their way inside, flanked by their lawyer. Tommy felt small in his ill-fitting suit, a hand-me-down from a cousin. As they entered the courtroom, he caught sight of his father for the first time since the arrest. James looked pale and gaunt, his usually immaculate appearance now disheveled. When their eyes met, James managed a weak smile, mouthing "I love you" to his son. The proceedings began, and Tommy listened intently as the prosecutor laid out the case against his father and Dr. Reeves. The charges were numerous and severe: unauthorized human experimentation, falsifying medical records, endangering the welfare of minors. With each accusation, Tommy felt his heart sink lower. But then it was the defense's turn. Their lawyer, Mr. Hartley, stood up, his voice resonating through the courtroom. "Your Honor, while we do not dispute that Dr. Thompson and Dr. Reeves acted outside the bounds of standard medical practice, we ask the court to consider the context and motivation behind their actions." He gestured to Maria, who sat nervously in the gallery. "We have an expert witness, Dr. Maria Gonzalez, formerly of Genentech, who can speak to the immense pressure and ethical dilemmas faced by researchers on the cutting edge of medical science." As Maria took the stand, Tommy watched in awe as the timid housekeeper he had known transformed into a confident, articulate professional. She spoke of her own past, of the thin line between breakthrough and disaster in medical research, and of the desperate hope that drives good people to make questionable choices. Dr. Thompson and Dr. Reeves were not acting out of malice or greed, Maria concluded, her voice thick with emotion. They were driven by a genuine desire to save lives, to spare other families the pain of losing a child to cancer. Their methods were wrong, yes, but their intentions were born of compassion. Next, to Tommy's surprise, Emily's parents were called to testify. He had expected them to be angry, to demand harsh punishment. Instead, Emily's mother spoke of her daughter's miraculous recovery. "We knew the risks when we agreed to the treatment," she said, tears in her eyes. "We were desperate, and Dr. Thompson gave us hope when no one else would. Yes, there were complications, and what he did was illegal. But our daughter is alive today because of him." As the hearing progressed, Tommy began to see the full complexity of the situation. It wasn't a simple case of right versus wrong, but a tangled web of hope, desperation, and the limitations of medical science and ethics. Finally, it was James's turn to speak. He stood slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he faced the judge. "Your Honor, I stand before you today not to make excuses, but to take full responsibility for my actions. I lost sight of the very oath I took as a doctor to first, do no harm. In my desperation to save lives, I put others at risk. I can only hope that by admitting my wrongs and sharing what I've learned, I can prevent others from making the same mistakes." He turned, looking directly at Tommy and Sarah. "To my family, I can only say that I'm sorry. I've let you down in ways I can never fully make right. But I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man, the father you deserve." As James sat down, the courtroom fell silent. Tommy felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name: pride, sadness, love, and a strange sense of hope. The judge cleared her throat. "This is a complex case that raises difficult questions about medical ethics and the limits of scientific research. While I cannot condone the actions of Dr. Thompson and Dr. Reeves, I also cannot ignore the context in which these actions took place." She paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. "In light of the testimony we've heard, and considering the defendant's willingness to cooperate fully with authorities, I am recommending that this case proceed to trial with the possibility of a plea agreement. I strongly urge both sides to consider a resolution that balances justice with compassion, and that takes into account the unique circumstances of this case." As the hearing adjourned, Tommy felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time since that night, he felt a glimmer of hope for his father's future. Outside the courthouse, as reporters clamored for statements, Sarah put her arm around Tommy's shoulders. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Tommy nodded, watching as his father was led away by guards. "Yeah, Mom, I think everything's going to be okay. Not the same as before, but okay." Maria joined them, her face etched with a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. "Your father has a long road ahead of him, Tommy, but he's taken the first step by accepting responsibility for his actions. That's no small thing." As they made their way through the crowd, Tommy caught snippets of conversations around him. Some people were angry, calling for harsh punishment. Others seemed more sympathetic, debating the ethics of medical research and the desperate measures people will take to save lives. Tommy realized that this story, his family's story, had become something bigger. It had sparked a conversation about the limits of science, the nature of ethics, and the complex choices faced by those on the front lines of medicine. As they reached their car, Tommy turned for one last look at the courthouse. He thought about his father, about Maria, about Emily, and all the other children whose lives had been forever changed by this ordeal. He thought about the future, his own, his family's, and the world of medicine he now knew he wanted to be a part of. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. It felt symbolic somehow, the end of one chapter, the beginning of another. Whatever came next, Tommy knew it would be shaped by the lessons learned in these past months. As they drove home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, Tommy made a silent promise to himself. He would learn from his father's mistakes, from Maria's wisdom, from the courage of patients like Emily. He would become a doctor, but one who never lost sight of the human beings behind the medical charts and test results. The story of the Thompson family was far from over. But as the familiar streets of their town came into view, Tommy felt ready to face whatever came next. He had seen the worst and the best of human nature, had grappled with questions most adults struggle to answer. And through it all, he had found a strength and clarity he never knew he possessed. The whisper in the night that had started this journey had become a roar of truth, echoing far beyond the walls of their home. And in that truth, painful as it was, lay the seeds of redemption, understanding, and hope. A year had passed since the hearing, and life for the Thompson family had settled into a new, if uneasy, routine. Dr. James Thompson had accepted a plea deal, resulting in a 5-year sentence, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. He was also required to participate in a program educating medical students about ethics in research. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Tommy and Sarah made their way through the prison security checkpoints for their monthly visit. Tommy, now 12, had grown taller, his face a little leaner, his eyes carrying a wisdom beyond his years. As they entered the visitation room, James stood up, a smile breaking across his face. "There's my boy," he said warmly, embracing Tommy. "And Sarah, you look beautiful as always." They sat down at the small table, the initial awkwardness of these visits having faded over time. James looked healthier than he had at the trial, his eyes clearer, his posture more relaxed. "How are you doing, Dad?" Tommy asked, studying his father's face. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm doing okay, son. The ethics lectures I've been giving, they've been challenging but rewarding. It feels good to use my experience to help guide the next generation of doctors." Sarah reached across the table, squeezing James's hand. "We're proud of you, James. You're making the best of this situation." James's eyes misted over. "I couldn't do it without your support. Both of you. And Maria, how is she doing?" Tommy perked up at this. "She's doing great, Dad. She's been working with a medical ethics board, sharing her experiences. And guess what? She's been helping me with my science fair project." James leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Oh, what's the project about?" "It's about ethical decision-making in medicine," Tommy explained excitedly. "We're doing a survey of doctors and medical students, presenting them with different scenarios and seeing how they respond. Maria says it's important to understand how people think about these issues before they're in high-pressure situations." James nodded, a mix of pride and sadness in his eyes. "That's fantastic, Tommy. You're already grappling with issues that took me years to fully understand." The conversation flowed easily after that, touching on Sarah's work, Tommy's school, and the latest developments in the ongoing discussions about medical research ethics that had sprung up in the wake of the Thompson case. As their visit time drew to a close, James grew serious. "Tommy, I want you to know something. What happened, the mistakes I made, they don't define who you are or who you'll become. You have a bright future ahead of you, son. Don't let my shadow hold you back." Tommy met his father's gaze steadily. "I won't, Dad, but I'm not running from it either. Everything that's happened, it's part of who I am now, and I think it's going to make me a better doctor someday." James blinked back tears, pulling Tommy into a tight hug. "You're going to be an amazing doctor, son. Far better than I ever was." As they said their goodbyes, Tommy felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time he could see beyond the scandal, beyond the pain. He could see a future where the Thompson name wasn't associated with disgrace, but with redemption and positive change. As they drove home, Sarah glanced at Tommy, a small smile on her face. "You okay, sweetheart?" Tommy nodded, watching the autumn leaves swirl past the car window. "Yeah, Mom. I think we're all going to be okay." The sun was setting as they pulled into their driveway, casting a warm glow over their neighborhood. Tommy saw Mrs. Peterson from next door wave hesitantly, a far cry from the open hostility they'd faced in the immediate aftermath of the scandal. Slowly but surely, life was moving forward. As they entered the house, Tommy's eyes fell on the kitchen table, where his science fair project lay spread out. Next to it was a framed photo of Lily, the little girl whose story had started it all. Tommy picked up the frame, studying the smiling face that had changed so many lives. In that moment, he made a silent promise to Lily, to Emily, to all the children whose lives had been touched by his father's actions. He would carry their stories with him, let them guide him as he navigated the complex world of medicine and ethics. The whisper in the night that had once revealed a dark secret had become a call to action, a beacon guiding Tommy towards a future full of purpose and possibility. As he set the photo down and turned to help his mother with dinner, Tommy Thompson knew that while the hardest chapter of their family's story might be over, the most important ones were yet to be written. 5 years had passed since that fateful night when a whisper in the dark had changed everything for the Thompson family. Today, the sun shone brightly over Millbrook, Connecticut, as 18-year-old Tommy Thompson adjusted his graduation cap in the mirror. "You ready, sweetheart?" Sarah called from downstairs. "Coming, Mom," Tommy replied, taking one last look at himself. The years had transformed him from a wide-eyed boy into a tall, confident young man. His eyes, though, still held that same determination, that same desire to understand and heal. As he descended the stairs, Tommy saw his mother waiting, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Behind her stood Maria Gonzalez, no longer their housekeeper, but a respected friend and mentor. "Oh, Tommy," Sarah breathed, straightening his tassel. "You look so handsome." Maria stepped forward, handing him a small, wrapped package. "A graduation gift," she said with a warm smile. "Open it later, when you have a moment alone." They piled into the car, the excitement palpable as they drove to the high school. Tommy's mind wandered to the empty seat in the car, the space where his father should have been. Dr. James Thompson had been released from prison 6 months ago, but he'd chosen to take a position at a remote clinic in Alaska, helping underserved communities while continuing to rebuild his life and reputation. The graduation ceremony was a blur of speeches, cheers, and flying caps. As valedictorian, Tommy took to the podium, his voice strong and clear as he addressed his classmates and the assembled families. "We stand here today on the threshold of our futures," he began. "Each of us shaped by our experiences, our triumphs, and yes, our failures. The road that brought me here wasn't always smooth, but it taught me invaluable lessons about integrity, compassion, and the profound responsibility we have to each other." His eyes found his mother in the crowd, saw her wiping away tears as he continued. "As we move forward into the world, let us remember that our actions have consequences that ripple far beyond ourselves. Let us strive to be not just successful, but ethical. Not just smart, but wise." As applause filled the auditorium, Tommy felt a sense of closure. High school had been challenging in ways he never expected, but he'd persevered, turning the notoriety of his family's scandal into a platform for change. His work on medical ethics had earned him national recognition and a full scholarship to Johns Hopkins University's pre-med program. After the ceremony, amidst the hugs and congratulations, Tommy felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Emily, the girl whose life had been changed by his father's experimental treatment. Now a healthy teenager, she smiled brightly at him. "Congratulations, Tommy," she said warmly. "Your speech was amazing." Tommy hugged her, marveling at how their paths had intertwined. "Thanks, Emily. How are you doing?" "Great," she beamed. "I just got accepted to nursing school. I want to work in pediatric oncology, help kids like me." As they chatted, Tommy felt a vibration in his pocket. He pulled out his phone to see a text from his father. "Congratulations, son. I'm so proud of you. Your journey is just beginning, and I know you'll do great things. Love, Dad." Tears pricked at Tommy's eyes as he read the message. Their relationship was still healing, but it was stronger now, built on honesty and shared understanding of the complexities of the medical world. Later that evening, as the excitement of the day waned, Tommy found himself alone in his room. He remembered Maria's gift and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, similar to the one his father had kept. A note fell out. "Tommy, your journey as a healer is just beginning. Use this journal to record your experiences, your doubts, and your triumphs. Let it be a reminder of where you came from and a guide to where you're going. Always remember, healing isn't just about medicine, it's about humanity. With love and pride, Maria." Tommy ran his fingers over the smooth leather, feeling the weight of its symbolism. He opened to the first page and began to write, "Today, I graduate not just from high school, but from the hardest lesson life has taught me so far. The whisper I heard that night years ago has become a call to heal, to understand, and to always do what's right, no matter how difficult. As he wrote, Tommy felt the threads of his past, present, and future weaving together. The scandal that had once threatened to define his family had become the foundation for a life dedicated to ethical, compassionate medicine. Outside his window, the sun was setting on his childhood in Millbrook. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, new whispers in the night. But this time, Tommy Thompson was ready to listen, to learn, and to let his experiences guide him towards becoming the doctor and the man he was meant to be. The journey that had begun with a secret in the dark had brought him here, to a place of understanding and purpose. As Tommy closed the journal and looked out at the fading light, he smiled, feeling not just the weight of his family's past, but the infinite possibilities of his own future. In that moment, as childhood gave way to adulthood, as scandal transformed into purpose, Tommy knew that the most important chapters of his story were still to come, and he was ready, pen in hand, heart open, to write them. Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.